My name is Rachel Martinez. I'm 32 years old, and I thought I knew what betrayal looked like until I walked into my childhood home 3 months after my divorce was finalized. Standing in my mother's kitchen, wearing my favorite apron and serving coffee to my relatives like she belonged there, was my ex-husband's new girlfriend. But what my mother said next didn't just break my heart. It shattered everything I thought I knew about family loyalty. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other Saturday. I had driven the familiar 40-minute route from my new apartment in downtown Phoenix to my childhood home in Scottsdale, the same drive I'd been making every weekend since my world fell apart 6 months earlier. The desert landscape blurred past my window as I tried to shake off another sleepless night. Divorce papers might declare your marriage officially over, but they don't come with instructions for rebuilding your entire identity at 32. I pulled into the circular driveway of the adobe-style house where I'd grown up, noting my mother's pristine garden beds filled with desert marigolds and palo verde trees. Everything looked exactly as it had for the past 15 years, which somehow made my own life feel even more chaotic by comparison. The house represented stability, tradition, family values that my mother, Carmen Martinez, had instilled in me since childhood. It was supposed to be my safe haven during this difficult transition. Walking up the flagstone path, I could hear voices and laughter coming from inside. My mother often hosted coffee mornings with her church friends or book club members, so the sounds weren't unusual. What struck me as odd was the timing. It was barely 9 in the morning, and these gatherings typically happened later in the day. I used my key to enter through the front door, calling out my usual greeting. The voices grew clearer as I approached the kitchen, and I recognized my Aunt Sofia's distinctive laugh, followed by my cousin Maria's voice. A family gathering I hadn't been told about. That stung a little, but I pushed the feeling aside. Maybe it was impromptu. Maybe they'd tried to call while I was driving. I rounded the corner into the spacious kitchen with its hand-painted tiles and copper fixtures, ready to greet my family with the forced cheerfulness I'd been perfecting since the divorce. That's when I saw her. Jessica Collins, my ex-husband David's girlfriend of 4 months, standing at my mother's granite countertop, pouring coffee from the ceramic pot my grandmother had brought from Mexico 50 years ago. She wore a flowing sundress in soft yellow, her blonde hair pulled back in a casual ponytail, looking completely at ease in my family's most sacred space. More than at ease. She looked like she belonged there. The conversation stopped abruptly when I appeared. 5 pairs of eyes turned toward me with expressions ranging from surprise to discomfort to something that looked uncomfortably like pity. My mother sat at the breakfast nook where I'd eaten countless meals growing up, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, looking like she'd been caught doing something she knew was wrong but planned to defend anyway. Jessica recovered first, offering me a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Rachel, how wonderful to see you. Your mother was just telling us about the charity auction she's organizing for the church." Her voice carried that particular tone people use when they're trying too hard to sound normal in an abnormal situation. I stood frozen in the doorway, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This woman, who had entered my life as the reason my marriage ended, was serving coffee to my family like some sort of welcomed guest. She knew where the mugs were kept. She moved around the kitchen with familiarity. This wasn't her first time here. My Aunt Sofia shifted uncomfortably in her chair, suddenly finding her coffee cup fascinating. Maria, my closest cousin, growing up, offered me a weak smile and a small wave, but couldn't maintain eye contact. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. "What is she doing here?" The words came out sharper than I intended, cutting through the artificial pleasantness that had settled over the room like morning fog. My mother's expression hardened slightly, the way it always did when she felt her authority was being questioned. Carmen Martinez had raised 4 children, largely on her own after my father's early death, and she developed an iron will that brooked no opposition in her own home. "Jessica is here because I invited her, Mija. She's family now." Family now. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my knees weaken and grabbed the doorframe for support. Family now. Jessica, who had been seeing my husband for months before I discovered their affair. Jessica, who had smiled at me sympathetically at various social gatherings while secretly planning my life's destruction. Jessica, who had never once shown remorse for her role in ending my marriage. She was family now. Family? I managed to croak, my voice barely above a whisper. My mother's chin lifted defiantly, a gesture I recognized from my childhood whenever she'd made a decision she wasn't willing to reconsider. David brought her to Sunday dinner 3 weeks ago. She's lovely, Rachel. Really lovely. And since she and David are getting married next month, yes, she's going to be part of this family, whether you like it or not. Married next month, another punch to the gut. Our divorce had been finalized exactly 93 days ago, and David was already planning his next wedding. The speed of it felt like a deliberate insult, as if our 8-year marriage had been nothing more than an inconvenient delay in his real love story. Jessica set down the coffee pot with delicate precision, her engagement ring catching the morning light streaming through the kitchen window. It was a stunning, pear-shaped diamond, easily twice the size of the modest solitaire David had given me when we were young and broke, and full of dreams about building a life together. "Rachel, I know this is difficult," she said in that same carefully modulated tone, "but I really hope we can find a way to get along. For the family's sake. For the family's sake." As if I were the one creating problems. As if my presence in my own childhood home was the source of awkwardness, rather than her stunning audacity in showing up here at all. I looked around the room at faces I'd known and loved my entire life. Aunt Sofia, who had taught me to braid friendship bracelets during long summer afternoons. Cousin Maria, who had been my maid of honor and had held me while I cried through the worst nights of my divorce. My mother, who had rocked me to sleep as a child and promised me that family would always be my safe place in a cruel world. All of them were looking at me like I was the problem. Like I was the one being unreasonable. Like I should graciously accept this woman into our family circle and pretend that her presence didn't represent the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about loyalty and love and the sacred bonds that were supposed to protect us from the world's cruelties. "I need some air," I said, backing toward the door. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the familiar kitchen suddenly seemed foreign and hostile. "Rachel, don't be dramatic," my mother called after me. "Come back and have coffee with us." Jessica made her famous cinnamon rolls. "They're delicious." Jessica's famous cinnamon rolls. In my grandmother's kitchen, served on the plates that had been wedding gifts from my parents. Marriage 40 years ago. The symbolism was so perfect, it felt deliberately cruel. I stumbled outside onto the patio where my father used to teach me to play guitar on Sunday afternoons before heart disease took him when I was 16. The Arizona sun was already climbing toward its daily assault on the desert, but I shivered as if it were winter. Through the sliding glass door, I could hear the conversation resume inside, my mother's voice taking on the bright, forced.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Tone she used when trying to smooth over family conflicts. My phone buzzed with a text message. David's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, my heart did that stupid hopeful flutter it always did when I saw his name. Even now, the message was brief and businesslike. "Mom told me you stopped by this morning. Hope you're being nice to Jess. She's really trying to fit in with the family." Mom told me. He was calling my mother Mom in texts to me about his new fiancé. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. After our divorce, I'd lost not just my husband, but apparently my right to call my own mother for comfort without worrying about whose side she'd taken in the split. I sat down heavily on the wooden bench my father had built, pulling my knees up to my chest like I used to do as a child when the world felt too big and scary to navigate. Through the kitchen window, I could see Jessica animated and smiling, telling some story that had my aunt and cousin laughing. She fit seamlessly into the group, as if she'd always been there, as if I were the intruder. The thing about betrayal is that it's rarely a single moment. It's a slow recognition that builds like storm clouds on the horizon, until suddenly you're standing in the downpour, wondering how you missed all the warning signs. Sitting on my father's bench, watching my replacement charm my family, I realized that this moment had been building for months. The signs had been there in my mother's careful neutrality whenever I talked about the divorce, in the way conversations seemed to stop when I entered rooms, in the gradual shift from supporting me through my pain to suggesting I move on and focus on healing. They had moved on without me. While I was struggling to rebuild my life, learning to sleep alone, figuring out how to cook for one person, and trying to rediscover who Rachel Martinez was outside of being David's wife, my family had apparently been getting to know my replacement. They had Sunday dinners with her, they shared recipes and stories and laughter. They had formed bonds and inside jokes, and the kind of casual familiarity that comes from repeated pleasant interactions. I had spent the last 6 months thinking that my family was my foundation, the solid ground beneath my feet while everything else shifted and crumbled. But foundations can be undermined slowly, invisibly, until you're standing on nothing at all. My phone rang. Maria's name appeared on the screen, and I almost ignored it, but curiosity won out. "Rachel, where did you go? Your mom is worried." "I'm in the backyard," I said, my voice sounding strange and hollow to my own ears. "Can I come out? I think we should talk." A few moments later, Maria emerged from the house, her expression carefully neutral. She'd always been the peacemaker in our family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and found compromises. At 30, she was 2 years younger than me, but had always seemed more mature, more diplomatic. We'd been incredibly close growing up, more like sisters than cousins, but I realized now that we hadn't had a real conversation since the divorce proceedings began. She sat down beside me on the bench, leaving a careful distance between us. "This is hard," she said simply. "Which part?" I asked. "Finding my ex-husband's mistress serving coffee in my childhood kitchen, or discovering that my family has apparently adopted her while I wasn't looking." Maria winced. "She's not a mistress anymore, Rachel. They're engaged. They're planning a life together. And yes, she's been coming around for a few weeks now." "A few weeks? How many weeks exactly?" Maria looked uncomfortable. "I think David first brought her to Sunday dinner about a month ago. Your mom liked her immediately. You know how she is about family gatherings. She wants everyone to feel welcome. Everyone except me, apparently. When was the last time anyone invited me to Sunday dinner?" "You've been invited every week. You always say you're too busy or too tired or need time to yourself." She was right, and that made it worse. I had been declining family invitations, telling myself I needed space to heal, that being around happy families would be too painful. While I was protecting myself from their joy, they had found a new family member to fill the empty chair at their table. So what? I'm just supposed to accept this? She destroys my marriage, and now I have to watch her take my place in my own family? Maria turned to face me fully. "Rachel, I love you. You're my cousin and my friend, and I hate that you're hurting. But Jessica didn't destroy your marriage. Your marriage was already broken when she came into the picture." The words stung because there was truth in them. David and I had been struggling for years before Jessica appeared. We'd grown apart slowly, the way couples do when career pressures and daily life gradually erode the connection that once seemed unshakable. We'd been living like roommates for months, going through the motions of marriage without any of the intimacy or partnership that made it meaningful. But knowing that our marriage was dying didn't make Jessica's role in its death any less painful. She had been the catalyst, the spark that had burned down the last pretense that David and I could fix what we'd broken. "Even if that's true," I said, "how can you all just welcome her like nothing happened? How can Mom call her family?" Maria sighed, looking out at the desert landscape that stretched beyond the backyard walls. "Because holding grudges doesn't bring anyone back from the dead, and it doesn't fix broken marriages. Your mom has seen enough pain in her life. She lost your dad when he was only 45. She watched you suffer through months of fighting with David. Now she sees a chance for the family to heal and move forward, and she's taking it. At my expense. Not at your expense, despite your absence." The distinction was subtle, but important. They weren't choosing Jessica over me. They were choosing to build relationships without waiting for me to be ready to participate. They were moving forward while I was still stuck in the anger and hurt of what had been lost. Through the kitchen window, I could see my mother and Jessica cleaning up the coffee service together, working in the easy rhythm of people who'd done this before. Jessica said something that made my mother laugh, a genuine, delighted sound I hadn't heard from her in months. She makes Mom happy, Maria said quietly, following my gaze. I know that's hard to hear, but it's true. Your mom has been so worried about you, so sad about the divorce, so guilty about not being able to fix things for you. Having Jessica around gives her someone to mother again, someone who appreciates her cooking and asks for her advice, and lights up when she shares stories about the family. I used to be that person. You still could be, but you'd have to actually show up. The accusation hung between us like a challenge. Maria was right again, and I hated her for it. I had been absent, not just physically but emotionally. I'd been so consumed with my own pain that I hadn't considered what my withdrawal was costing the people who loved me. How am I supposed to show up when she's there? I asked. How am I supposed to sit at the same table and make small talk with the woman who's wearing my ex-husband's ring? I don't know, Maria admitted, but I know that staying away isn't working for anyone. You're miserable. Your mom is torn between wanting to support you and wanting to embrace her future daughter-in-law, and the rest of us are walking on eggshells trying not to take sides. Future daughter-in-law. The phrase settled over me like a heavy blanket. This wasn't temporary. Jessica wasn't going anywhere. In a month, she would legally be part of my family, entitled to be at every holiday gathering, every birthday celebration, every milestone moment for the rest of our lives. I could either find a way to coexist with that reality, or I could resign myself to permanent exile from my own family. The wedding is next month? I asked. Maria nodded. Small ceremony at the Botanical Gardens. Just immediate family and close friends. Am I invited? The Aunt Sofia question hung in the air longer than it should have. Maria's hesitation told me everything I needed to know. I think David wants to invite you, she said carefully. But Jessica is worried it would be too uncomfortable for everyone. Jessica was worried about my comfort level at my ex-husband's wedding. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. And what does Mom think? She thinks you should come. She says family is family, no matter what. Family is family. The same words she'd used to justify Jessica's presence in our kitchen. Apparently the definition of family had become fluid in my absence, expanding to include the woman who'd helped end my marriage while somehow still encompassing me despite my exile. I should go, I said, standing up from the bench. I can't do this right now. Rachel, wait. Maria stood too, reaching for my arm. Don't leave like this. Come back inside. Try to have a normal conversation with her. For 5 minutes. For Mom's sake. For Mom's sake. The same phrase Jessica had used. The magic words that were supposed to make me swallow my hurt and pretend everything was fine. I'm not ready, I said simply. When will you be ready? I looked back at the kitchen window where my mother and Jessica were now sitting at the breakfast nook, heads bent together over what looked like wedding planning materials. Swatches of fabric and printed pages spread across the table where I used to do homework while my mother cooked dinner. I don't know, I said honestly. Maybe never. Maria's expression softened with something that looked like pity, and that was somehow worse than anger would have been. Pity meant she'd given up on me, that she'd decided I was the problem that needed to be managed, rather than the victim who deserved support. I hope you figure it out soon, she said gently. Because this family needs you. But we're not going to stop living while you decide whether you want to be part of it. I walked back through the house toward the front door, my footsteps echoing on the terracotta tiles that had been imported from Mexico when my parents first bought the house 30 years ago. In the kitchen, conversation paused as I passed, and I felt their eyes following me. Rachel? My mother's voice called out, tinged with the particular combination of love and exasperation she'd perfected during my teenage years. You're leaving already? I paused at the threshold between the kitchen and the hallway, not turning around. I have errands to run. Stay for lunch. Jessica is making her grandmother's enchilada recipe. It's supposed to be incredible. Jessica's grandmother's enchilada recipe. In my grandmother's kitchen. Using my grandmother's cast iron skillet, probably. The one that had been seasoned with decades of family meals and passed down through generations of Martinez women who had all understood that food was love, and the kitchen was the heart of the home. I can't, I said, and this time I didn't try to hide the break in my voice. I made it to my car before the tears started. Sitting in my mother's driveway, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white, I cried for everything I'd lost and everything I was still losing. I cried for the marriage that had died slowly and painfully. I cried for the family that was moving on without me. I cried for the woman I used to be, the one who had felt secure in her place in the world and confident in the love of the people closest to her. But mostly I cried because I knew that Maria was right. This family needed me, but I had to decide whether I was strong enough to fight for my place in it, or whether it would be easier to let them go and build something new entirely. As I drove away from the house where I'd learned what love was supposed to look like, I realized that my real journey was just beginning. The divorce had been the end of one chapter, but this morning had shown me that I still had choices to make about what came next. I could remain bitter and isolated, nursing my wounds and my righteousness. Or I could find a way to reclaim my place in my family without letting anyone else's presence diminish my own worth. The sun climbed higher in the desert sky as I drove toward my uncertain future, leaving behind the woman who had once believed that family loyalty was simple and love was permanent and home was a place where you always belonged. That woman was gone forever. But maybe, just maybe, the woman I was becoming could be stronger, wiser, and brave enough to redefine what family meant on her own terms. The road ahead stretched endlessly through the Arizona landscape, and for the first time since my world had fallen apart, I pressed harder on the accelerator, eager to see where it would take me. The weeks following that devastating morning at my mother's house passed in a haze of forced normalcy and underlying chaos. I threw myself into work with the desperate energy of someone trying to outrun their own thoughts. As a senior marketing coordinator for a renewable energy company, I had the luxury of losing myself in campaigns and client presentations. But even the most demanding projects couldn't completely silence the voice in my head that replayed my mother's words on an endless loop. She's family now. My downtown Phoenix apartment, a sleek one-bedroom with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, had initially felt like freedom after years of living in the suburban home David and I had shared. Now it felt like a fortress I'd built to keep the world out, but it was also keeping me trapped inside my own anger and confusion. The sparse furniture and minimal decoration reflected my emotional state perfectly. I hadn't bothered to make it feel like home because I wasn't sure what home meant anymore. 3 weeks after the kitchen incident, my phone rang during my lunch break. Mom's name appeared on the screen, and I stared at it for several rings before answering, unsure what to expect. "Minja, we need to talk." Her voice carried that particular tone of maternal authority that brooked no argument. "About what?" I asked, though we both knew exactly what. "About this foolishness. About you avoiding your family because you're angry at circumstances none of us can control." I set down my salad, appetite gone. "Circumstances we can't control?" "Mom, you invited my ex-husband's fiancée into our home. You called her family. That wasn't circumstances, that was a choice." "Yes, it was a choice," she said firmly. "A choice to embrace love instead of bitterness. A choice to welcome someone who makes David happy, instead of holding grudges that serve no one." "Someone who makes David happy," I repeated. "What about what makes me happy? What about my feelings in all this?" There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was gentler, but no less determined. "Your happiness matters to me more than anything, Rachel. But your happiness cannot depend on everyone else staying frozen in place while you figure out how to heal. The world keeps turning, Mija. People fall in love, they get married, they become part of families. You can either be part of that world or stand outside it, but you cannot stop it from happening." The logic was sound, but it felt like a betrayal disguised as wisdom. So I'm just supposed to smile and pretend everything is fine? Play happy family with the woman who helped destroy my marriage? I'm asking you to consider that maybe your marriage was already destroyed, and maybe continuing to blame Jessica for that is hurting you more than it's hurting anyone else. I hung up without saying goodbye, my hands shaking with anger and hurt. But her words stayed with me for the rest of the day, and that night I found myself doing something I'd avoided for months. I pulled out my laptop and began typing, not a work email or a grocery list, but something deeper. A letter I would never send. An attempt to sort through the tangle of emotions that had been choking me since the divorce. David, I wrote, then stopped. What could I possibly say to him that would matter now? That I missed the life we'd planned together? That I was angry about how quickly he'd moved on? That seeing him happy with someone else felt like proof that our entire relationship had been a mistake? Instead, I found myself writing to the woman I used to be, to Rachel, who was married, who had believed in forever and happily ever after and the kind of love that could weather any storm. I wrote about the gradual erosion of our connection, the way we'd stopped really seeing each other, somewhere in the middle of building careers and maintaining a household and going through the motions of a partnership that had become more habit than choice. I wrote about the night I'd found the text messages on David's phone, the sick feeling of recognition that had settled in my stomach as I read conversations that revealed months of emotional intimacy with another woman. I wrote about the confrontation that followed, the way he'd looked, almost relieved to have been caught, as if he'd been waiting for permission to stop pretending our marriage was something worth saving. I wrote about the divorce proceedings, the careful division of assets and memories, the way we'd managed to be civil and practical even as we dismantled the life we'd built together. I wrote about moving into my apartment and feeling simultaneously liberated and terrified by the silence that greeted me at the end of each day. And finally, I wrote about the morning in my mother's kitchen, about the shock of seeing Jessica so at home in my family's space, about the realization that while I'd been mourning my old life, everyone else had been building new relationships without me. Writing it all down didn't solve anything, but it clarified something important. I wasn't just angry at Jessica or hurt by my family's acceptance of her. I was grieving the loss of my identity as David's wife, as the daughter who belonged unquestionably in her family's inner circle, as someone who knew exactly where she fit in the world. The next morning I did something I hadn't done in months. I called in sick to work and drove to my mother's house unannounced. I needed to have a real conversation, not the careful exchanges we'd been managing over the phone, but an honest discussion about where we stood and what came next. I found her in the backyard, tending to her vegetable garden in the early morning coolness. She looked up when she heard my footsteps on the gravel path, and her face brightened with genuine pleasure before settling into cautious hope. "You look terrible, Migwa," she said with the blunt honesty that had always been her way of showing love. "I feel terrible," I admitted, settling down on the ground beside her despite my work clothes. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday." She continued pulling weeds, giving me space to find my words. And I think you're right about some things. My marriage was broken long before Jessica came along. David and I had been strangers living in the same house for months. Maybe years, if I'm being honest. "That doesn't make the end any less painful," she said softly. "No, it doesn't. But it does make it less Jessica's fault." The admission felt like pulling a splinter from an infected wound. Painful, but necessary for healing. I've been so angry at her because it was easier than being angry at myself for letting my marriage die slowly instead of fighting for it. My mother's hands stilled in the dirt. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I checked out too, Mom. I stopped trying to connect with David. I stopped making an effort to be the wife he needed. I let work become more important than our relationship. I settled for being roommates instead of partners because it was easier than doing the hard work of rebuilding what we'd lost." It was the first time I'd admitted that out loud, and saying it felt like stepping off a cliff. For months, I'd cast myself as the wronged party, the victim of David's betrayal and Jessica's selfishness. Acknowledging my own role in the marriage's failure meant giving up the righteous anger that had been sustaining me. "Marriage is hard work, Mija," my mother said gently. "Sometimes people grow apart despite their best efforts. Sometimes they grow apart because they stop making those efforts. But understanding what went wrong doesn't mean you have to be friends with your replacement." "Is that what she is? My replacement?" My mother sat back on her heels, studying my face. "Jessica is the woman David chose to build a future with. You were the woman he built a past with. Those are different things entirely." The distinction was subtle but important. Jessica wasn't erasing my history with David. She was creating a new story with him. My 8 years of marriage still mattered, still had value, even if they hadn't led to the ending I'd hoped for. "I don't know how to be around her," I said. I don't know how to make small talk with someone who knows all the intimate details of my failed marriage. I don't know how to smile and be gracious when part of me still wants to scream at her. Then don't be around her yet, my mother said practically. But don't punish the rest of your family for accepting her either. Come to Sunday dinners when she's not here. Call me during the week. Spend time with Maria and your other cousins. Maintain your relationships with us while you figure out how to handle the situation with Jessica. It seemed like such an obvious solution that I felt foolish for not thinking of it myself. I'd been operating under the assumption that accepting Jessica into the family meant I had to be present for it, but that wasn't necessarily true. I could maintain my own relationships while keeping a respectful distance from hers. When is she usually here? I asked. Sunday dinners, obviously. Sometimes Saturday mornings for coffee. Occasionally during the week when she and David come by after work. And you enjoy her company? My mother nodded without hesitation. I do. She's kind, she's interested in family history, she asks thoughtful questions, and she clearly adores David. She makes him laugh in a way he hadn't for years before the divorce. That last observation stung, but it also rang true. David had been serious and stressed during the final years of our marriage, carrying the weight of our mutual disappointment like a heavy coat he couldn't take off. If Jessica brought back his laughter, that was probably good for everyone, even if it hurt to acknowledge. The wedding is next month, I said. Yes. Are you going? We all are. Your brothers, your cousins, even your Aunt Sofia, who you know hates weddings on principle. But not me. My mother reached over and took my dirt-stained hand in hers. That's up to you, Mija. David wants you there. Jessica says she wants you there, though I suspect that's more politeness than genuine desire. I want you there because I want all my children present for family milestones, even difficult ones. What would I even wear to my ex-husband's wedding? The question came out before I could stop it, and it sounded so absurd that we both started laughing. Definitely not white, my mother said dryly, and I laughed harder than I had in months. The tension that had been knotted in my chest for weeks began to loosen slightly. I wasn't ready to forgive Jessica or embrace her as family, but maybe I could stop seeing her presence as a deliberate attack on my place in the family structure. I should get to work, I said eventually, brushing dirt off my pants. Take some tomatoes, my mother insisted, filling a grocery bag with produce from her garden. You're too thin, and I know you're not cooking for yourself properly. As I prepared to leave, she caught my arm. Rachel, there's something else we need to discuss. My stomach tightened. What? David and Jessica are going to have children eventually. Probably soon, given their ages. Those children will be your brothers, nieces, and nephews. They'll be part of this family's next generation. The words hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't thought, beyond the wedding, beyond the immediate challenge of accepting Jessica's presence. I hadn't considered the long-term implications of David creating a new family that would be forever intertwined with mine. I can't think about that right now, I said quickly. I know it's hard, but you need to think about it eventually. Because when those babies come, this family is going to love them unconditionally. And if you want to be part of their lives, you'll need to find peace with their mother. I drove to work in a daze, my mother's words echoing in my head. David and Jessica's hypothetical children would grow up calling my mother abuela. They would play in the backyard where I'd learned to ride a bike. They would sit at the breakfast nook where I'd done homework and shared secrets and planned my future. They would be loved and welcomed and considered family in a way that had nothing to do with me. The thought should have filled me with rage or resentment, but instead, I felt something unexpected. A tiny seed of curiosity about what those children might be like, whether they would have David's quiet intensity or Jessica's apparent warmth. Whether they would love my mother's cooking and listen eagerly to her stories about the family's history in Mexico. At work, I found myself distracted, staring out my office window at the Phoenix skyline while thinking about the complexity of family relationships. I'd been operating under the assumption that there was only so much love to go around, that accepting Jessica meant there was less room for me. But watching my mother's face that morning when she talked about future grandchildren, I'd seen something different. Love multiplied rather than divided. There was room for Jessica and room for me, room for old relationships and new ones, room for the family I'd been born into and the family that was still forming. That didn't mean it would be easy. It didn't mean I had to like Jessica or pretend to be her friend. But it did mean I could stop seeing her existence as a threat to my own. 3 days later, I did something that surprised everyone, including myself. I called David. "Rachel?" His voice carried surprise and wariness in equal measure. "Is everything okay?" "I want to talk to you about the wedding," I said without preamble. There was a pause. "Okay. What about it?" "I want to come." Another pause, longer this time. "Are you sure?" "I mean, I'd love to have you there, but I don't want you to feel obligated. And I don't want it to be painful for you." "It's going to be painful regardless of whether I'm there or not," I said honestly. "But I've been thinking about what Mom said about family milestones, and I think she's right. This is happening whether I participate or not. I'd rather be part of it than stand outside it." "Jessica will be so relieved," he said, and I could hear the genuine gratitude in his voice. "She's been worried that our marriage is causing problems between you and your family." Our marriage. The phrase stung, but less than I'd expected. David and Jessica's marriage was a separate entity from the marriage David and I had shared. It didn't erase our history or diminish what we'd once meant to each other. "There's one condition," I said. "Name it." "I want to bring a date." David laughed, a sound I hadn't heard directed at me in years. "Of course. Anyone I know?" "His name is Marcus. I met him at a work conference last month." This was only partially true. I had met Marcus at a conference, and we had exchanged numbers, but we'd only been on 2 casual coffee dates. Still, the thought of attending David's wedding alone felt too pathetic to bear. "I'm happy you're dating again," David said, and he sounded like he meant it. "I was worried you were isolating yourself too much." The concern in his voice reminded me of why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. David was fundamentally a good person who wanted the people he cared about to be happy, even when those relationships became complicated. "I'm figuring things out," I said. Slowly. "Good. That's really good, Rachel." After hanging up, I stared at my phone for several minutes before scrolling through my contacts to find Marcus's number. We'd had pleasant conversations over coffee, and he'd mentioned being recently divorced himself. Maybe he'd understand the complexity of attending an ex-spouse's wedding. "Rachel?" he answered on the second ring. "This is a nice surprise." "Hi, Marcus. I have a somewhat unusual question for you." "I'm intrigued. Would you be interested in being my date to my ex-husband's wedding next month?" There was a pause, and then he started laughing. "That might be the most honest invitation I've ever received. Tell me more." I explained the situation as simply as I could, emphasizing that this wasn't about romance but about having moral support during a difficult family event. Marcus listened without interruption, asking only a few clarifying questions. "So let me make sure I understand," he said when I finished. "You want me to accompany you to watch your ex-husband marry the woman he left you for, surrounded by your family who has apparently already adopted said woman as one of their own?" When you put it like that, it sounds completely insane. It sounds like something that requires either tremendous courage or complete self-destructive tendencies. I'm hoping it's the former. "Me too. Count me in," he said without hesitation. "I've been to my share of awkward family events since my divorce. Sometimes having a friendly witness makes all the difference." The wedding was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at the Desert Botanical Garden, a venue that felt perfectly suited to Jessica's aesthetic of natural beauty and understated elegance. The ceremony would be small, just immediate family and close friends, followed by a dinner reception at a nearby restaurant. In the weeks leading up to the event, I found myself in the strange position of helping my mother plan for my ex-husband's wedding. She enlisted my assistance with flower arrangements and menu consultations, treating it like any other family celebration. It was surreal but oddly healing to focus on the practical details, rather than the emotional implications. Jessica wants to use your grandmother's cake server for the reception, my mother mentioned during one of our planning sessions. I looked up from the seating chart I'd been reviewing. My grandmother's cake server? The silver one that's been in the family for generations. Jessica knows the history behind it, and she thinks it would be a beautiful way to honor family tradition. The request should have felt presumptuous, but instead, it struck me as thoughtful. Jessica was trying to connect with our family's history, to understand the significance of the objects and traditions that had shaped the people she was marrying into. That's fine, I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. Grandmother would have liked that her cake server was being used for family celebrations. My mother squeezed my hand. You're growing into a very wise woman, Mija. I'm trying to grow into someone I can respect, I corrected. Someone who doesn't let bitterness poison her relationships with the people she loves. The night before the wedding, I had dinner with Marcus at a quiet restaurant downtown. He'd driven down from Flagstaff, where he worked as a landscape architect, and I was grateful for his calm presence and outside perspective on the situation. Are you nervous? He asked over appetizers. Terrified, I admitted, but also relieved. I feel like I've been holding my breath for months, and tomorrow I'll finally be able to exhale. What's the worst thing that could happen? I considered the question seriously. I could have an emotional breakdown during the ceremony. I could say something cruel to Jessica. I could realize that I'm still in love with David and make a fool of myself. And what's the best thing that could happen? I could get through it with dignity and tact. I could genuinely wish them well. I could feel proud of myself for being the bigger person. And what's the most likely thing that will happen? I smiled at his methodical approach to my anxiety. I'll probably cry at some point, but quietly. I'll make polite conversation with Jessica and mean most of it. I'll realize that David and I really are better as ex-spouses than we were as spouses. And I'll go home feeling like I've closed a chapter instead of still writing it. That sounds like a pretty good outcome to me. That night, I laid out my outfit for the wedding. I'd chosen a navy blue dress that was elegant but not attention-grabbing, paired with my grandmother's pearl earrings for emotional support. Looking at the ensemble, hanging in my closet, I thought about all the versions of myself I'd tried on and discarded since the divorce. The bitter ex-wife. The wounded victim. The defiant, independent woman. The prodigal daughter. Tomorrow, I would try on one more version. The gracious family member who could celebrate love, even when it wasn't her own. The woman who could share space with her replacement without feeling diminished by it. The daughter who chose connection over righteousness. I wasn't sure yet if that version of myself would fit, but I was finally ready to find out. The morning of David's wedding dawned with the kind of crystalline desert sky that made Phoenix feel like paradise. I woke before my alarm, my stomach churning with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Marcus had stayed at a nearby hotel, and we'd arranged to meet for breakfast before the ceremony. As I showered and applied my makeup with extra care, I caught glimpses of myself in the bathroom mirror, and was surprised to see that I looked calmer than I felt. The navy dress fit perfectly, and my grandmother's pearls felt like a talisman against my throat. I'd chosen low heels that would be comfortable for walking on the garden paths, and I'd practiced my smile in the mirror until it looked natural rather than forced. I was as ready as I would ever be to watch my ex-husband marry another woman. Marcus picked me up at 10, looking handsome in a charcoal suit that complemented my dress perfectly. He'd brought me a small corsage of white roses, a gesture so unexpectedly thoughtful that I felt tears prick my eyes. "For courage," he said simply, helping me pin it to my dress. "Thank you." I managed, touched by his understanding of how significant this day was for me. Over breakfast, at a quiet cafe near the botanical garden, Marcus distracted me with stories about his landscape architecture projects and questions about my work in renewable energy marketing. His calm presence steadied my nerves, and by the time we headed to the ceremony, I felt centered enough to handle whatever the day might bring. The desert botanical garden was transformed into a wedding venue that took my breath away. Jessica had chosen to hold the ceremony in the desert discovery loop, surrounded by towering saguaro cacti and blooming desert wildflowers. White chairs were arranged in intimate rows, facing an arch made of palo verde branches and white roses. The setting was breathtakingly beautiful, a perfect blend of natural desert majesty and romantic elegance. As Marcus and I found our seats in the third row, I spotted my family scattered throughout the small gathering. My mother sat in the front row, wearing her best dress and a radiant smile. My brothers flanked her with their wives, and I could see Maria and Aunt Sofia a few rows ahead. Everyone looked happy and festive, as if this were any other family celebration rather than a potentially awkward situation. David stood at the altar with his best man, looking nervous but genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen in years. He wore a perfectly tailored gray suit with a white rose boutonniere, and his face had the soft, anticipatory expression of a man who believed he was about to marry his soulmate. For the first time since discovering his affair, I felt genuinely glad for his happiness rather than resentful of it. The ceremony began with a string quartet, playing something classical and beautiful that I didn't recognize. Jessica's bridesmaids walked down the aisle first, two women I didn't know wearing flowing dusty rose dresses that complemented the desert setting perfectly. Then the music changed to a more traditional wedding march, and Jessica appeared at the entrance to the ceremony space. She was absolutely radiant. Her dress was a simple but elegant sheath of ivory silk that skimmed her curves without being ostentatious. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a sophisticated updo, adorned with small white flowers, and she carried a bouquet of white roses and desert blooms. But more than her appearance, it was the expression on her face that took my breath away. She looked at David like he was the answer to every prayer she'd ever whispered, like he was her safe harbor and her greatest adventure all at once. I had never looked at David that way. Even on our wedding day 8 years ago, I had been excited and happy but not transported. I had loved him, but I had never looked at him like he was the center of my universe. Watching Jessica walk toward him with such obvious adoration, I realized something profound about why our marriage had failed. We had loved each other, but we had never been each other's great love story. The realization should have been devastating, but instead, it felt like a release. David deserved to be loved the way Jessica clearly loved him, and I deserved to find someone who looked at me the way David was looking at Jessica as she approached the altar. Our marriage hadn't failed because we were bad people, or because we hadn't tried hard enough. It had failed because we hadn't been the right people for each other, not in the deep soul-level way that created lasting partnerships. The officiant, a friend of David's from college who had become a minister, began the ceremony with words about love, commitment, and the courage it takes to build a life with another person. As he spoke about the challenges and joys of marriage, I found myself thinking about my own failed attempts at partnership and what I had learned from them. David and Jessica, the officiant said, have asked to write their own vows, sharing with all of us the promises they want to make to each other as they begin this new chapter of their lives together. David spoke first, his voice steady but emotional. Jessica, when I met you, I had given up on the idea that I could feel this kind of joy again. You brought laughter back into my life when I had forgotten what it sounded like. You made me remember that love doesn't have to be a struggle, that partnership can be easy when you find the right person to share it with. His words stung, but they also rang with truth. Love had been a struggle for us, full of misunderstandings and hurt feelings, and the constant work of trying to force compatibility where it didn't naturally exist. If he had found something easier and more joyful with Jessica, I couldn't begrudge him that gift. I promise to never take your laughter for granted, David continued. I promise to support your dreams even when they scare me. I promise to choose us every day, even when life gets complicated. And I promise to love you not just for who you are today, but for who you're still becoming. When it was Jessica's turn, her voice trembled with emotion, but her words were clear. David, you taught me that love doesn't have to hurt to be real. You showed me that I could be completely myself with another person, and be cherished for it, not in spite of it. You made me believe in forever again, when I thought that was just something that happened to other people. Her vows continued with promises about adventure and stability, about growing old together and supporting each other through whatever challenges life might bring. As she spoke, I found myself genuinely moved by her sincerity. These weren't just pretty words for the sake of the ceremony. This was a woman who had found her person and was grateful for the gift. The ring exchange was simple but meaningful, and when the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss was tender and full of promise. The small gathering erupted in applause and happy tears, and I realized that I was clapping too, genuinely celebrating their union, rather than just going through the motions. As the newly married couple walked back down the aisle together, Jessica caught my eye and gave me a small, grateful smile. For the first time since I'd met her, I smiled back without reservation. She hadn't stolen my husband. She had found her soulmate, and he had happened to be someone I had loved but couldn't keep happy. There was a difference, and acknowledging it felt like stepping out of a dark room into sunlight. The cocktail hour was held in another section of the garden, surrounded by towering cacti and desert blooms. Marcus proved to be excellent company, charming my family members and giving me space to process my emotions without making me feel abandoned. I found myself actually enjoying conversations with relatives I hadn't seen since before the divorce, catching up on their lives without the weight of pity or awkwardness I'd been dreading. My mother approached me during the cocktail hour, her face glowing with happiness and relief. "You look beautiful today, Mija," she said, embracing me warmly. "And you seem peaceful." "I feel peaceful," I said, surprising myself with how true it was. This is exactly what David needed, what they both needed. "And what do you need?" she asked gently. I looked around at the garden full of family and friends celebrating love, at Marcus chatting easily with my brother about hiking trails, at David and Jessica posing for photos with expressions of pure joy. "I need to stop trying to live in the past and start building something new," I said. "I need to forgive myself for the ways I failed in my marriage, and forgive David for the ways he failed too. And I need to accept that endings can be gifts, even when they don't feel like it at the time." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so proud of the woman you're becoming." During the dinner reception at an elegant restaurant overlooking the valley, I found myself seated at a table with Marcus, my cousins, and two of Jessica's friends from work. The conversation flowed easily, covering everything from travel stories to career challenges to funny anecdotes about the bride and groom. Jessica's friends were warm and inclusive, treating me like any other family member rather than the potentially awkward ex-wife. When it came time for toasts, David's best man spoke about their friendship and David's transformation over the past year. "I've never seen David this happy," he said simply. "Jessica, whatever magic you're working, please keep it up." Then my brother James stood up, surprising everyone, including me. "I want to say something about family," he began, looking directly at Jessica. "Our family has always believed that love multiplies rather than divides. Today we're not losing David to marriage. We're gaining Jessica as a sister, and I want to thank her for bringing out the best in someone we all care about deeply." The toast was gracious and inclusive, acknowledging the complexity of the situation without dwelling on the awkwardness. I felt a surge of gratitude for my brother's diplomacy and emotional intelligence. When the dancing began, Marcus proved to be an excellent partner, spinning me around the small dance floor with confidence and humor. During a slow song, he pulled me close and spoke quietly in my ear. "How are you holding up?" "Better than I expected," I admitted. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for some wave of grief or anger to hit me, but instead, I just feel relieved." Relieved? Like I've been carrying around this story about myself as the wronged woman, the victim of betrayal, the abandoned wife. But watching them together today, I realize that's not the real story. The real story is that two people who weren't right for each other found the courage to let go so they could both find happiness elsewhere. "And have you found happiness elsewhere?" he asked, twirling me gently. I considered the question as we swayed to the music. "I'm working on it," I said honestly. "For the first time in months, I feel like it's actually possible." Later in the evening, as the reception was winding down, Jessica approached me while I was gathering my purse and preparing to leave. She looked radiant but slightly nervous, clearly wanting to say something but unsure how to begin. "Rachel," she said finally, "I wanted to thank you for being here today. I know it couldn't have been easy, and it means more than you know that you chose to celebrate with us." "Congratulations," I said, and meant it completely. "You two are perfect together. Watching you during the ceremony, I could see how much you love each other. It's beautiful." She looked surprised by my sincerity. "I want you to know that I never intended for things to happen the way they did. David and I tried to stay away from each other when we realized we had feelings, but—" "Jessica," I interrupted gently, You don't owe me an explanation or an apology. David and I were over long before you came into the picture. If anything, you helped us both realize that we deserved something better than what we had together." Tears filled her eyes. "You're being so much more gracious than I deserve." "You're not my enemy," I said, realizing the truth of it as I spoke. "You're just a woman who fell in love with a man who happened to be married to someone else. We've all made choices we're not proud of. What matters is what we do next." She hugged me then, a quick but genuine embrace. "I hope we can be friends someday," she said. "Let's start with family," I suggested. "Friends might come later, but family is what we are now, for better or worse." As Marcus and I left the reception, I felt lighter than I had in months. The dreaded event was over, and not only had I survived it, I had genuinely enjoyed parts of it. More importantly, I had seen David and Jessica as they really were rather than through the lens of my own hurt and anger. They were good people who had found each other at the right time in their lives. Their happiness didn't diminish me. It just existed alongside my own journey toward healing. On the drive home, Marcus was quiet, letting me process the evening's emotions without pressure to analyze or explain them. Finally, as we pulled into my apartment complex, he spoke. "That was one of the most emotionally mature things I've ever witnessed," he said. "The way you handled yourself tonight, the grace you showed toward people who hurt you, the genuine joy you expressed for their happiness. It was really remarkable." "I didn't feel remarkable," I said. "I felt like I was finally growing up." Maybe that's the same thing. 3 weeks after the wedding, I received an unexpected invitation. David and Jessica were hosting a small dinner party for family and close friends, and they wanted Marcus and me to attend. The invitation felt like an olive branch, an acknowledgement that we had all successfully navigated the wedding and might be ready to move forward as an extended family unit. I almost declined out of habit, but something made me reconsider. Maybe it was time to test whether the peace I'd felt at the wedding could extend to more casual interactions. Maybe it was time to see if Jessica and I could actually coexist in normal social situations without the high emotions of a wedding ceremony. The dinner party was held at David and Jessica's new home, a charming bungalow in an established neighborhood with mature trees and a backyard garden. As Marcus and I walked up to the front door, I felt nervous but not panicked. This was just dinner with family, I reminded myself. People did this all the time. Jessica answered the door wearing a casual sundress and a genuine smile. "Rachel, Marcus, I'm so glad you could make it." She ushered us inside, taking our coats and offering drinks with the easy hospitality of someone who truly wanted us there. The house was beautifully decorated in a style that was completely different from the one David and I had shared. Where our home had been minimalist and modern, this one was warm and eclectic, filled with plants and artwork and the kind of collected treasures that made a space feel lived in and loved. It suited David in a way our sterile perfection never had. The other guests included my parents, my brother James and his wife, Jessica's parents who had flown in from Colorado, and another couple who were friends of theirs from work. The conversation flowed easily over cocktails and appetizers, covering topics ranging from local politics to travel recommendations, to funny stories about the wedding. During dinner, Jessica's father told entertaining stories about her childhood, revealing a sense of humor and warmth that explained where she got her natural charm. David looked relaxed and happy in a way I hadn't seen since the early days of our marriage, before life's pressures and our incompatibilities had worn down his natural optimism. At one point during the meal, Jessica mentioned that they were planning to start trying for children soon. "We're not getting any younger," she said with a laugh, "and David is eager to be a father." The comment should have stung since children had been a source of tension in our marriage. David had wanted to start a family years ago, but I had always found reasons to postpone it. Career goals, financial concerns, the feeling that we needed to fix our relationship before adding the stress of parenthood. Now I realized that my reluctance hadn't been about timing or practical concerns. Some part of me had known that David and I weren't solid enough to build a family together. "You'll be wonderful parents," I said sincerely, and David's grateful smile told me he understood what that cost me to say. After dinner, while the others chatted in the living room, I found myself in the kitchen helping Jessica with the dishes. It was a domestic scene that should have felt surreal, but instead felt surprisingly natural. "Thank you for coming tonight," she said as we worked side by side at the sink. "I wasn't sure you'd be comfortable, but I really wanted you here." "Why?" I asked, genuinely curious. She considered the question while drying a wine glass. "Because you're important to David. And David is important to me. I want all the people he loves to feel welcome in our home. But also because I think you're an incredible person, and I'd like to get to know you better outside of all the complicated history." Her honesty was disarming. "I'm still figuring out how to navigate all this," I admitted. "The family dinners, the holidays, the future children who will be David's but not mine. It's not exactly a situation they prepare you for in divorce counseling." "No," she agreed with a rueful laugh. "But maybe we can figure it out together. Make up the rules as we go along." "Maybe we can," I said, and realized I actually meant it. 6 months later, I was sitting in my mother's backyard helping her plant her spring vegetable garden, when she brought up a subject that had been on my mind as well. "Jessica is pregnant," she announced without preamble, her hands busy with tomato seedlings. "I know," I said. "David called to tell me last week. How do you feel about that?" I considered the question while digging holes for the pepper plants. "Happy for them," I said finally. "And a little sad for the woman I used to be, who thought David and I would have children together someday. But mostly just happy. This baby will be your niece or nephew, you know," my mother said carefully. "David is still your family, even if he's not your husband anymore." "I know that too," I said. "And I'm looking forward to meeting him or her when the time comes." My mother's face broke into a smile. "Really? Really? I want to be the kind of aunt who shows up for birthday parties and school plays and all the important moments. I want to be someone that child can count on. Even though it means sharing space with Jessica for the rest of your life? Especially because of that," I said. "I want to model for this child that adults can handle difficult emotions with grace. That families can be complicated and still be loving. That there's enough room for everyone at the table." As if summoned by our conversation, my phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Would you like to come to dinner Sunday to celebrate the pregnancy? I'm making that enchilada recipe your mom taught me." I showed the message to my mother, who beamed with pride. "Look at that! She wants to make my enchiladas for the celebration." "Your enchiladas," I said with a smile. "Not her grandmother's enchiladas, yours. Yours too, mija. I taught them to both of you." I typed back my acceptance of the dinner invitation, then put my phone away and returned to planting vegetables that would feed my family through the summer months. The garden would grow and flourish, just as our family was learning to grow and accommodate new members and new relationships. There would be plenty of room for everyone, plenty of love to go around, plenty of space at the table for all the complicated, beautiful, imperfect people who had somehow become part of each other's stories. That evening, as I sat on my apartment balcony watching the sunset paint the Phoenix sky in shades of pink and gold, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this place of acceptance and peace. The woman who had stood frozen in her mother's kitchen 9 months ago, shattered by the sight of her replacement, felt like a stranger now. That woman had been trapped in a story about loss and betrayal, unable to see past her own pain to the larger picture of love and family and second chances. The woman I was becoming understood that endings were sometimes the greatest gifts we could give each other. That holding on too tightly to what was meant to be temporary could prevent us from discovering what was meant to be permanent. That family wasn't just about blood or law or tradition, but about choosing to love imperfect people in imperfect circumstances and making room for everyone at the table. My phone rang, interrupting my contemplation. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with a smile. "How was your day?" he asked, his voice warm with genuine interest. "Perfect," I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. "Absolutely perfect." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.